A wealthy lawyer humiliates a little girl on the street, but moments later, he realizes the shocking truth. This child isn't just any stranger. What happens next is a roller coaster of emotions, filled with unexpected twists, painful secrets, and a fight for redemption. Can a broken family find its way back together, or will dark lies tear them apart forever? Stay tuned. You won't believe how this story unfolds. It was a cold, rainy Monday morning in downtown Chicago. The kind of morning where the rain didn't just fall. It slashed across the city like a million tiny daggers, piercing through the thick mist that hugged the towering skyscrapers. Ethan Blake, a high-powered attorney with a reputation for being ruthless, stepped out of his sleeky apartment building, his Italian leather shoes splashing through puddles as he briskly walked down the sidewalk. He didn't flinch at the cold or the rain. His mind was already a million miles away, focused on the high-stakes meeting he had in just under an hour. His assistant, Avery, had texted him 3 times that morning, reminding him about the important client waiting at the office. Ethan glanced at his phone, irritation flashing across his face. I know. He muttered under his breath, stuffing the phone back into his pocket. He checked his watch, a sleek silver Rolex that glinted even in the gray light of the morning. He was running late, and that was the last thing he needed today. As he turned the corner, his gaze fixed on the revolving doors of the office building, just a block away. He almost didn't notice the small figure standing in the middle of the sidewalk. A little girl, no older than 10, was hunched over, holding a box of cookies. Her clothes were soaked through, clinging to her thin frame. Her curly hair, drenched by the rain, fell over her face in wet clumps. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of irritation flashing in them. He sidestepped her, but she took a step forward, blocking his path. "Excuse me, mister," she called out, her voice barely more than a whisper, but it carried an edge of desperation. "Would you like to buy some cookies? They're for my brother's treatment." Her big, dark eyes looked up at him, filled with a mix of hope and fear. Ethan barely glanced at her. "Not today," he snapped, pushing past her with more force than necessary. The girl stumbled back, and the box of cookies slipped from her hands, spilling its contents onto the wet sidewalk. The rain beat down on the scattered cookies, dissolving them into a soggy mess. For a brief second, Ethan paused, his conscience pricking at him like a thorn. But he shook it off. He couldn't afford to be late because of some kid selling cookies. "Move along," he muttered, stepping over the ruined cookies as he continued on his way. Behind him, the girl dropped to her knees, scrambling to gather the soaked cookies with trembling hands. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking as she looked up. But Ethan didn't turn around. He didn't see the tears welling up in her eyes, mixing with the rain that streamed down her cheeks. He was already halfway down the block, his mind back on his meeting, oblivious to the small, broken figure he'd left behind. By the time he reached the doors of his office building, he had already forgotten about the encounter. The doorman gave him a polite nod, which Ethan ignored as he pushed through the revolving doors. He was greeted by the warmth of the building's lobby, the scent of fresh coffee wafting from the cafe near the elevators. His assistant, Avery, was waiting for him just beyond the security gates, her face a mask of efficiency, though there was a hint of concern in her eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Blake," she said, handing him a steaming cup of black coffee and a neatly arranged stack of documents. "Your meeting with the Ridgemont Group starts in 20 minutes. They're already in the conference room." Ethan took the coffee without looking at her, flipping through the documents as he made his way to the elevator. "Any calls?" he asked curtly. Avery hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, actually." There was a call from Daniel Harper. Ethan's steps faltered slightly. It was almost imperceptible, but Avery noticed. He recovered quickly, masking his reaction with a dismissive wave. "I'll deal with it later," he muttered, stepping into the elevator. "Focus on the Ridgemont meeting for now." But the name lingered in the air, like a ghost he couldn't shake off. Daniel Harper. It had been years since they last spoke. Ethan's mind flashed back to a time when they were inseparable. Best friends, almost like brothers. They had shared everything once. Dreams, ambitions, and countless nights talking about their futures. But that was a lifetime ago. Before the falling out, before they went their separate ways, the elevator doors slid shut, and Ethan was alone with his thoughts as the car ascended. He took a deep breath, trying to push the memories away. He needed to be sharp, focused. The Ridgemont deal was worth millions, and he couldn't afford to be distracted by ghosts from his past. He stepped out of the elevator and strode into the conference room, where the Ridgemont executives were already seated. Ethan forced a smile, slipping effortlessly into his role as the confident, charming attorney they had hired. The meeting was a blur of numbers, legal jargon, and contract negotiations, but somewhere in the back of his mind, Daniel's name kept resurfacing. As the meeting wrapped up, the Ridgemont CEO shook his hand with a grin. "Great work, Blake. This is exactly why we chose your firm." Ethan nodded, flashing a practiced smile. "Always a pleasure doing business with you." But the moment the clients were out the door, his facade cracked. He turned to Avery, who had been taking notes at the side of the room. "Get me Daniel Harper's number," he said, his voice sharp. Avery blinked, surprised by the sudden urgency in his tone, but she nodded quickly. "Right away, Mr. Blake." Ethan stalked back to his office, closing the door behind him with a thud. He leaned against the desk, staring at the phone, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. What could Daniel possibly want, after all this time? He picked up the receiver, dialing the number Avery had scribbled on a piece of paper. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Just as he was about to hang up, a voice answered. "Ethan?" It was Daniel, but he sounded different, tired, broken. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. "Yeah, it's me." "What's going on, Daniel? Why the urgent call?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Ethan could hear the sound of Daniel taking a shaky breath. "I need your help," Daniel finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's my daughter, Naya. She's been missing for 3 years. Ethan felt the ground shift beneath his feet. 3 years? He echoed, stunned. "Why didn't you call me sooner?" "I tried," Daniel replied, a bitter edge to his voice. "But you were always too busy, always in some important meeting." Guilt washed over Ethan like a tidal wave, threatening to pull him under. He thought back to the girl on the sidewalk, the soaked cookies, her pleading eyes. It couldn't be. Could it? "Daniel," Ethan said slowly, his voice thick with dread. I think I saw her this morning." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "What did you say?" Daniel's voice was a mixture of shock and hope, as fragile as glass. "I'm not sure, but I pushed a girl aside outside my office. She was selling cookies. She mentioned needing money for her brother's treatment." "Oh my God," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. "Ethan, you have to find her. Please, don't let her out of your sight." Ethan's hands were shaking as he hung up the phone. He grabbed his coat and rushed out of the office, leaving Avery staring after him in confusion. For the first time in years, he felt real fear. Not the fear of losing a client or missing a deal, but the fear of having made a mistake he couldn't undo. The rain was still pouring as he sprinted down the sidewalk, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to find her. He had to make this right. "Naya," he called out, his voice lost in the roar of the city. "Where are you?" He had no idea if she could hear him, but he had to try. He couldn't shake the image of her small, soaked figure, kneeling in the rain, trying to salvage the ruined cookies. He had walked away once, but he wouldn't make that mistake again. This time, he wouldn't stop until he found her. Ethan's shoes pounded against the rain-soaked pavement as he darted through the streets of Chicago. The cold rain stung his face, but he didn't slow down. His mind was racing faster than his feet. 3 years, Daniel's voice echoed in his head, laced with a desperation that Ethan had never heard before. He couldn't shake the image of the little girl, Nia, kneeling in the rain, her small hands desperately trying to gather the ruined cookies. "This can't be real," Ethan muttered to himself, his breath coming out in ragged gasps. He'd dismissed her, ignored her pleas without a second thought. But now, knowing who she might be, the realization was like a punch to the gut. "I have to find her." He reached the spot where he'd seen her earlier that morning. It was empty now, just a few soggy crumbs left behind on the sidewalk, dissolving into the puddles. Ethan ran a hand through his soaked hair, feeling a wave of panic he hadn't experienced in years. "Nia," he called out, his voice cracking. He scanned the faces of the passers-by, hoping for a glimpse of her, but she was nowhere to be seen. He fished his phone out of his pocket, his fingers trembling, as he dialed Daniel's number again. It rang once, twice. Then Daniel picked up, his voice raw and breathless. "Ethan, did you find her?" Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, swallowing hard before answering. "No, but I'm at the spot where I saw her. She's gone, Daniel. I don't know where she went." There was a beat of silence, filled only by the sound of rain hammering against the pavement. Then Daniel's voice came through, broken and pleading. "Ethan, you have to keep looking. You don't understand. Vivian is out there. If she finds Naya first—" His voice trailed off, but the unspoken threat hung heavy in the air. Ethan's stomach twisted. Vivian Turner, Naya's grandmother. The woman who had always been cold, calculating, and manipulative. He hadn't seen her in years, but the mere mention of her name was enough to send a chill down his spine. "I'll find her, Daniel," Ethan said, his voice firmer now. "I won't let Vivian get to her." He ended the call and shoved the phone back into his pocket, setting off again, his eyes scanning every alley and doorway. He couldn't believe he was in this position, searching for the daughter of his estranged best friend, the same friend he hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. It felt surreal, like he was caught in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Inside Blake and Associates, the tension was palpable. Avery paced back and forth in the reception area, glancing at the clock every few seconds. Ethan had stormed out of the office without a word, leaving a room full of confused clients and executives in his wake. It was unlike him. Ethan Blake never abandoned a meeting, especially one as crucial as the Ridgemont deal. "What's going on?" one of the senior partners asked, his brow furrowed. "Where did Ethan go?" Avery forced a tight smile, trying to keep her voice steady. "He had an emergency come up," she said, her eyes flicking towards the door. "He'll be back soon." But even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed it. She'd seen the look on Ethan's face when he heard Daniel Harper's name. It was a look she hadn't seen before, fear mixed with something else, regret maybe. She pulled out her phone and typed a quick message. "Where are you? Are you okay?" There was no reply. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time Ethan found her. Naya was huddled under the awning of a small bakery, her thin shoulders trembling as she tried to shield herself from the cold. Her clothes were soaked through, clinging to her tiny frame. She looked up as he approached, her eyes wide with fear and recognition. "Hey, it's okay," Ethan said, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. He crouched down in front of her, trying to make himself seem less intimidating. "I'm not going to hurt you, I promise. I just want to talk." Nia's eyes darted around, searching for an escape route. "You're the man who pushed me," she whispered, her voice tinged with both accusation and hurt. The words hit Ethan like a slap. "I know," he admitted, his voice rough with regret. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I didn't realize who you were." Nia hugged the box of ruined cookies to her chest, her gaze narrowing suspiciously. "How do you know my name?" Ethan hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "Your dad," he said finally. "Daniel Harper. He's been looking for you. He asked me to help find you." At the mention of her father's name, Nia's expression crumpled. She shook her head violently, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, you're lying," she cried, her voice rising in panic. "He doesn't want me. He never looked for me. Grandma said he was glad we were gone." Ethan's heart clenched at the raw pain in her voice. He reached out slowly, but Nia flinched away, pressing herself against the brick wall. "Nia, listen to me," he pleaded. "Your dad loves you. He's been searching for you for years. Whatever your grandmother told you, it's not true." But Nia wasn't listening. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Passers-by glanced at them curiously, but Ethan didn't care. He couldn't leave her like this. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling her small frame shake beneath his touch. "I know you're scared," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "And I know I'm just a stranger to you. But please, let me help you. Let me take you somewhere safe." For a moment, Nia didn't move. Then slowly she lowered her hands and looked up at him, her tear-streaked face filled with a vulnerability that broke his heart. "Safe," she repeated, as if the word was foreign to her. Ethan nodded. "Yes, safe. I'll take you to my place, and we'll call your dad. He's waiting for you, Nia. He wants to see you." She hesitated, her lip quivering. "What about Grandma?" she whispered, her voice laced with fear. Ethan clenched his jaw, feeling a surge of anger at the thought of Vivian Turner. "Don't worry about her," he said firmly. "I won't let her take you. Not until you see your dad." Nia stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deceit. Finally, she gave a small, hesitant nod. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders, shielding her from the cold. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's get you out of this rain." They started walking together, Nia clinging to his side, as if she were afraid he might disappear. As they made their way down the street, Ethan couldn't help but glance down at her, his heart aching with a strange mixture of guilt and protectiveness. He had no idea what kind of hell she had been through, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to fail her now, not this time. As they approached his apartment building, Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from Avery. "Vivian Turner is here at the office. She's asking for you." Ethan's blood ran cold. He looked down at Nia, her small face pressed against his side, trusting him for the first time. "It's going to be okay," he said, though his own voice was filled with uncertainty. "I won't let her take you." But deep down, he knew the real battle was just beginning. Ethan led Nia through the revolving doors of his apartment building. The warmth inside was a stark contrast to the cold rain that had soaked them both. Nia clutched his coat around her shoulders, looking small and out of place amidst the sleek, polished marble floors and designer decor. The doorman gave them a curious glance, but said nothing as Ethan gave a curt nod and ushered Naya toward the elevator. As the doors closed, sealing them off from the outside world, Ethan let out a slow breath. He glanced down at Nia, who was huddled against the wall, staring at the floor. Her wet curls clung to her cheeks, and her eyes, wide and filled with fear, darted around like she was trapped. "Hey," Ethan said softly, crouching down to her level. "You're safe now, okay? We're going up to my apartment, and I'll get you something dry to wear." Nia didn't respond. She just nodded slightly, her eyes flicking up to meet his for a brief second, before looking away again. It was as if she didn't dare to trust him yet. Ethan's heart twisted. He couldn't imagine what kind of trauma she had endured, but he was determined to earn her trust. The elevator dinged as it reached his floor, and the doors slid open. Ethan stepped out, guiding Naya down the hall to his apartment. He unlocked the door and pushed it open, stepping aside to let her in first. She hesitated at the threshold, peering inside with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. "Go ahead," Ethan urged gently. "It's okay." Naya took a tentative step inside, her eyes widening as she took in the modern furnishings, the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sweeping view of the Chicago skyline, and the warm, inviting glow of the lights. It was a far cry from the damp alleyways and bus shelters she had been hiding in. "Wow," she whispered, almost to herself. "You live here? Alone?" Ethan nodded, feeling a pang of guilt at the awe in her voice. It was just an apartment to him, a place he came back to at the end of a long workday. But to Naya, it was a glimpse into a world she could only dream about. "Yeah," he replied softly. "But tonight, you're staying here with me. Let's get you into some dry clothes, and then we can call your dad, okay?" The mention of her father seemed to pierce through the fog of uncertainty in her eyes. She looked up at Ethan, her lips parting, as if she were about to say something. But before she could, there was a loud, insistent knock at the door. Ethan's entire body tensed. "Who is it?" Nia asked, her voice small and trembling. Ethan's heart raced as he crossed the room to the door. He peered through the peephole and felt his stomach drop. It was Avery, and standing right behind her, with a stern, unyielding expression, was Vivian Turner. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. He turned back to Naya, who was watching him with wide, frightened eyes. "Stay here," he whispered. "Don't come to the door, okay?" Naya nodded, slipping behind the kitchen counter, her small form barely visible as she crouched down. Ethan took a deep breath, then opened the door a crack. "Ethan," Avery said quickly, her eyes flicking from his face to the room behind him. "I'm so sorry. She just showed up at the office demanding to see you. I couldn't stop her." "It's fine, Avery," Ethan said tightly, stepping outside and closing the door behind him. He turned to face Vivian, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Turner, to what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Vivian's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a thin, humorless smile. She was dressed impeccably, as always, in a tailored coat and heels, her silver hair pulled back into a severe bun. She looked every bit the wealthy, controlling matriarch she had always been. "Cut the pleasantries, Ethan," she snapped. "I know you have Nia in there. Hand her over to me now, and I might not press charges for kidnapping." Ethan's jaw clenched. "Kidnapping? Are you serious? She came with me willingly. I found her on the street, alone, soaking wet. Where were you, Vivian? Clearly not looking out for her." Vivian's eyes flashed with anger, but she kept her voice level, like she was speaking to a disobedient child. You have no idea what you're talking about. Naya needs to be with family, someone who can take care of her properly. Daniel abandoned her, just like he abandoned my daughter. Ethan felt a surge of fury at her words. You don't get to rewrite history, he shot back, stepping closer until they were almost nose to nose. You manipulated her, poisoned her against her father. I'm not letting you take her. Vivian's smile vanished, replaced by a look of icy determination. You're making a big mistake, Ethan, she hissed. You think you can just swoop in and play the hero? You have no idea what you're getting involved in. Ethan didn't flinch. Maybe not, he said, his voice calm but laced with steel. But I know one thing. I'm not letting you near her until she sees her dad. There was a tense silence. Avery stood off to the side, her eyes darting nervously between them. Finally, Vivian let out a short, humorless laugh and stepped back. Fine, she said, her voice dripping with contempt. But this isn't over, Ethan. You're going to regret getting in my way. She turned on her heel and strode down the hallway, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. Avery let out a shaky breath. What the hell was that? She whispered. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the adrenaline start to drain from his body. A problem? He muttered. A very big problem. He glanced back at the door. Thank you, Avery. I'll handle it from here. Avery gave him a worried look, but nodded. Be careful, Ethan, she said softly, before walking away. Ethan slipped back inside the apartment and locked the door behind him. He turned to find Naya standing in the middle of the room, her face pale. Was that my grandma? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah, it was. But don't worry. I won't let her take you. Naya's shoulders sagged with relief, but there was still a shadow of fear in her eyes. She said you kidnapped me. Ethan knelt down in front of her, looking her in the eye. Listen to me, Nia. You're not a prisoner here. You're free to leave if you want. But I promised your dad I'd keep you safe until he gets here. That's what I'm trying to do. I just want to help. Nia bit her lip, the way she did when she was nervous. My grandma. She told me my dad didn't want me, that he was glad when we left. Her voice broke on the last word, and she looked away, tears welling up in her eyes. Ethan's heart clenched. He reached out and gently took her hand. Naya, that's not true, he said firmly. Your dad has been looking for you for years. He loves you more than anything. I swear on my life. For a long moment, Naya just stared at him, her dark eyes searching his face for any sign of a lie. Finally, she squeezed his hand back, a small, fragile smile breaking through her tears. Okay, she whispered. I believe you. Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze and pulled her into a gentle hug. It's going to be all right, he murmured, more to himself than to her. We're going to figure this out together. But as he held her, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real storm was only just beginning. Ethan held Nia tightly, feeling the small shudders of her body against his chest. He could sense the raw fear coursing through her, fear of the unknown, fear of betrayal, and the aching fear of being abandoned yet again. He knew that fear all too well, though he had buried it deep under years of cold professionalism and courtroom victories. But with Naya here, clutching at him like he was the last safe harbor in a storm, those old emotions bubbled to the surface. Hey, he whispered, pulling back slightly to look at her tear-streaked face. We're okay now. I've got you. And your dad. He's on his way. Naya's breath hitched at the mention of her father. You really called him? She asked, her voice fragile, as if she were afraid the answer might shatter her hopes. Ethan nodded, brushing a wet curl away from her cheek. He's on his way right now. He's probably racing through traffic as we speak. He managed a small smile. You know, your dad was never one to wait around. A flicker of a smile touched Nia's lips, but it was fleeting, quickly replaced by the deep-seated worry she couldn't quite hide. What if? She trailed off, looking down. What if he's mad at me? The question pierced Ethan's heart. Mad at you? Why would he be mad at you, Nia? She shrugged, her small shoulders hunching up defensively. Grandma always said it was my fault we had to leave, that I made everything harder for everyone. Ethan's jaw clenched, anger boiling beneath his calm exterior. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to keep his voice gentle. That's not true. None of this is your fault. Your dad loves you, and he's been searching for you every single day. He's going to be over the moon when he sees you. Nia looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. Finally, she gave a small, hesitant nod. Okay, she whispered, but her grip on his hand didn't loosen. They sat together on the couch, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Ethan kept glancing at the clock, counting down the minutes until Daniel arrived. He could almost picture it. Daniel slamming on the brakes outside, sprinting up the stairs, and bursting through the door like a man possessed. He's going to be here any minute now, Ethan murmured, squeezing Nia's hand. Are you ready? Nia didn't answer right away. She was staring at her reflection in the dark glass of the window, her expression unreadable. I don't even know what to say to him, she admitted softly. It's been so long. What if he doesn't want me anymore? Ethan's heart ached at the vulnerability in her voice. He turned toward her, cupping her cheek gently. Nia, look at me. She hesitated, then slowly met his gaze. Your dad wants you more than anything in this world. Nothing you say or do could ever change that. Before she could respond, there was a loud, frantic knock at the door. Nia froze, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He knew that knock. It was the sound of a man desperate to get to his child. That's him, Ethan said, standing up and moving toward the door. He looked back at Nia, who was still sitting on the couch, looking like a deer caught in headlights. It's going to be okay, he assured her. I'll be right here. He opened the door, and there stood Daniel Harper, drenched from head to toe, his eyes wild with a mix of panic and relief. He looked thinner than Ethan remembered, his hair streaked with gray, and there were deep lines etched into his face that hadn't been there before. It was as if the years had carved away at him, piece by piece. Ethan, Daniel gasped, barely glancing at him before his eyes swept the room, searching. Where is she? Where's Nia? Ethan stepped aside, his throat tight with emotion. She's right here, he managed to say. Daniel's gaze locked onto Nia, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The world outside, the rain, the city noise, the chaos, faded into nothing. All that existed was a father and his daughter, staring at each other across the room after years of separation. Nia, Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. He took a tentative step forward, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. Nia stood up slowly, her hands trembling at her sides. Dad, she whispered back, her voice so soft it was barely audible. In an instant, Daniel crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. Nia collapsed against him, her small body racked with sobs. Oh, my baby girl, Daniel choked out, his own tears mingling with the rain still clinging to his face. I'm so sorry. I never stopped looking for you. Not for 1 second. I thought you didn't want me, Nia cried, her voice muffled against his chest. Grandma said you were glad we were gone. Daniel pulled back, cupping her face in his hands, his expression filled with a pain so deep it seemed endless. No, Naya, that was never true. I wanted you every day, every moment. I would have given anything to have you back. Ethan stood off to the side, watching the reunion unfold with a lump in his throat. He had imagined this moment in his head, but the reality of it was far more raw and emotional than he'd prepared for. It was like watching the breaking of a dam, years of suppressed grief and love flooding out all at once. I'm sorry, Nia whispered, clutching her father's shirt like she was afraid he might disappear. I'm sorry for running away. I didn't know what else to do. Daniel shook his head, pressing his forehead against hers. You have nothing to apologize for. I'm just so glad you're here. We're together now. That's all that matters. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped up in each other, as if trying to make up for all the lost time. Ethan felt like an intruder in this intimate moment, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. He had been part of this journey, whether he wanted to admit it or not, and seeing them together felt like a resolution he hadn't realized he needed. Eventually, Naya pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked up at Daniel, her expression hesitant. What about Grandma? She asked, her voice laced with fear. She's going to be mad. Daniel's face hardened, his expression shifting from relief to anger. He glanced at Ethan, who gave him a solemn nod. She came here, Ethan explained quietly. She tried to take Naya, but I didn't let her. She's not going to get away with this, Daniel. Daniel hugged Naya tightly, his eyes flashing with a fierceness that Ethan hadn't seen before. She's not going to touch you again, he promised. I'll fight for you, Naya. I'll fight with everything I have. Nia looked up at her father, her fear slowly giving way to a small, hopeful smile. You really mean that? I do, Daniel said, his voice unwavering. I lost you once, and I'm not going to lose you again. Ethan cleared his throat, stepping forward. We need to prepare, he said. Vivian isn't going to back down easily. We're going to have a legal battle on our hands. Daniel nodded, looking at Ethan with a gratitude so deep it made Ethan feel uncomfortable. Thank you, he said quietly, for finding her, for bringing her back to me. Ethan shrugged, trying to play it off. I just did what anyone would do. No, Daniel corrected, his voice firm. You did more than that. You were there when I couldn't be. You kept her safe. Ethan felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He managed a small smile. Then let's make sure we keep her safe from here on out. The three of them stood together, a makeshift family bound by circumstance and a shared promise. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and the city was beginning to dry under the pale afternoon sun. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a sense of hope in the air, and as they looked at each other, they all knew one thing. This was just the beginning of their fight, but it was a fight they were ready to face together. The rain had stopped, but the storm brewing inside Ethan's apartment was far from over. As the sun peeked through the clouds, casting golden light across the room, it felt like a fragile peace, a temporary lull before the next wave hit. Daniel and Naya were sitting together on the couch, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm wrapped protectively around her. It was a quiet, tender moment, but Ethan knew they couldn't stay like this for long. Vivian Turner wasn't the kind of woman to walk away without a fight. Ethan cleared his throat, breaking the silence. We need to talk, he said gently, meeting Daniel's eyes. About what happened. About why Naya was out there alone. Daniel's face hardened, a flicker of pain flashing across his features. He held Naya closer, as if afraid she might slip away if he loosened his grip. I should have been there, he muttered, his voice thick with guilt. I never should have let her go with Vivian in the first place. Naya looked up at him, her eyes wide with confusion. Dad, what do you mean? She asked softly. Grandma said you didn't want me. She said you... Her voice broke, and she looked away, tears welling up again. Daniel's face crumpled, and he turned to Ethan, his eyes pleading. Can you give us a minute? Ethan nodded, stepping back toward the kitchen. He busied himself with making a pot of coffee, giving them some semblance of privacy. But he couldn't help listening in. He needed to hear this just as much as Nia did. Sweetheart, Daniel began, his voice cracking. I need you to listen to me, and I need you to believe me. Whatever your grandmother told you, it wasn't true. Naya pulled back slightly, her brow furrowed. But she said you didn't love Mom anymore, that you wanted us to go away, so you could be free. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, as if the words were physical blows. No, Nia, he whispered. I loved your mom more than anything. But she was sick. She had an illness, bipolar disorder. It made her see things that weren't there, believe things that weren't true. Naya's breath hitched, her small hands gripping the fabric of the couch. I don't understand, she said, her voice trembling. She always seemed happy. Daniel let out a broken laugh, filled with years of pent-up sorrow. She had moments like that, yes. But there were other times too. Times when she was so sad, she couldn't get out of bed. Or when she was so angry, she would scream for hours. I tried to help her, but she wouldn't take her medication. She didn't want to admit she needed help. Ethan watched from the kitchen, his heart heavy, as the pieces of the story fell into place. He had known Daniel and his wife Sarah back in the early days. He remembered the way Sarah's smile could light up a room, but he also remembered the dark clouds that sometimes hovered behind her eyes. So why did you leave? Naya's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the air like a knife. Daniel's face twisted in anguish. I didn't want to, sweetheart. I filed for divorce because I thought it might shock her into getting help. I thought that if she realized she was going to lose us, she might finally agree to treatment. He swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a broken whisper. But I was wrong. Instead of getting help, she took you and ran. And then she disappeared. The room was silent, except for Nia's soft, hitched breathing. She looked up at her father, tears streaming down her cheeks. Why didn't you find me sooner? She asked, her voice filled with a deep, aching hurt. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. I tried, Naya. I searched everywhere. But Vivian, she made it impossible. She had money, power, and connections. Every time I got close, she moved you somewhere else. Ethan stepped forward, unable to stay silent any longer. Vivian manipulated everything, he said, his voice steady, but filled with anger. She wanted control over you, Naya. She didn't care about what was best for you or your mom. She just wanted to win. Naya wiped her eyes, staring at Ethan as if seeing him in a new light. Why did you help me? She asked, her voice small and full of uncertainty. You didn't know me. You could have walked away. Ethan's heart clenched at the question. He knelt down in front of her, looking into her eyes. Because I did walk away, he admitted, his voice filled with regret. The first time I saw you, I pushed you aside like you were nothing. I didn't realize who you were, but that doesn't matter. I hurt you, and I was wrong. Helping you was the only way I could make it right. Naya's lip quivered, but she nodded slowly, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her shirt. Thank you, she whispered, for coming back. Ethan gave her a small, sad smile. It's me who should be thanking you. You reminded me of what's important. Just then, there was another knock at the door. This time it was a soft, hesitant knock. Ethan's stomach dropped. He knew who it was, before he even opened it. He pulled the door open to find Vivian Turner standing there, her face pale and drawn. She looked less like the powerful, imposing woman he had faced earlier, and more like someone who had aged 10 years in the span of a day. Her eyes darted to Nia, who was clinging to her father, then back to Ethan. "I need to speak with you," she said quietly. "Alone." Ethan glanced back at Daniel, who gave him a wary nod. "I'll handle this," Daniel said softly, stroking Nia's hair as she buried her face against his chest. Ethan stepped outside, closing the door behind him. He and Vivian stood in the hallway, the silence between them heavy and charged. "What do you want, Vivian?" Ethan asked, his voice cold. Vivian's face crumpled, and for the first time, Ethan saw something like genuine regret in her eyes. "I never wanted it to come to this," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought I was doing what was best. Sarah, she was my only child. When she ran away, I thought if I kept Nia, I could keep a piece of her with me." Ethan shook his head, anger bubbling up again. "You lied to Nia. You made her believe her father didn't want her. You've caused nothing but pain." Vivian's eyes filled with tears, and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "I know," she whispered. "I know I made mistakes. But I'm begging you, Ethan. Please don't shut me out. I want to make this right." Ethan stared at her, searching her face for any sign of manipulation, any hint that this was another one of her games. But all he saw was a broken woman, a mother who had lost her daughter and was clinging desperately to her granddaughter as a way to cope with her grief. He let out a slow breath. "This isn't up to me," he said finally. "It's up to Nia and Daniel. If they decide to give you another chance, that's their choice. But you need to respect whatever they choose." Vivian nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I will," she promised. "I swear. I just want what's best for her now." Ethan opened the door and stepped aside, watching as Vivian entered the apartment. Daniel looked up, his face a mixture of surprise and wariness. "Vivian," he said, his voice flat. She clasped her hands together, looking at Nia with eyes full of sorrow. "Nia, sweetheart," she began, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I lied to you because I thought it was the only way I could keep you safe. But I see now that I was wrong. I just want you to be happy." Nia stared at her, her face unreadable. Then slowly, she slipped off the couch and walked over to her grandmother. She looked up at Vivian, tears welling up in her eyes. "I forgive you, Grandma," she said softly. "But I want to be with my dad now." Vivian nodded, her face crumpling with relief and heartbreak. "Okay," she whispered, reaching out to gently touch Nia's cheek. "Okay, my sweet girl." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden light across the room, it felt like the first true moment of peace they'd all had in years. The sun had set, and the golden light in the apartment gave way to shadows as night fell over Chicago. Ethan, Daniel, and Nia sat together at the dining table, a heavy silence hanging in the air. The raw emotions from their reunion had faded, replaced by the looming reality of what lay ahead. Vivian's apology had been unexpected, but it didn't change the fact that she had already initiated legal proceedings to take Nia away. Ethan leaned back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose. "We need to talk about what happens next," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but edged with urgency. "Vivian isn't going to back down easily. This custody battle is going to get ugly, and we have to be prepared." Daniel looked exhausted, his eyes bloodshot and filled with worry. He squeezed Nia's hand, giving her a reassuring smile, before turning to Ethan. "What are our options?" he asked, his voice rough. Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing at Nia, who was sitting quietly, her eyes darting between her father and Ethan, trying to make sense of the situation. "We have a strong case," Ethan began, choosing his words carefully. "You're her biological parent, and you've been actively searching for her for years. That counts for a lot. But—" he paused, his expression darkening. "Vivian has money, connections, and she's already painted you as an unfit father. We need to counter her narrative." Daniel's jaw clenched. "She's going to lie," he muttered, bitterness creeping into his voice. "She'll twist everything to make it seem like I abandoned Nia." Ethan nodded. "I know. That's why we need to be strategic. We'll need character witnesses, evidence of your efforts to find Nia. And most importantly," he looked at Nia, his expression softening, "we need Nia's voice. If she's willing, her testimony could be what tips the scales in our favor." Nia's eyes widened, and she shrank back slightly in her chair. "You want me to talk to the judge?" she whispered, her voice filled with fear. Daniel's face softened, and he pulled her into a gentle hug. "Only if you're comfortable, sweetheart," he said soothingly. "We won't make you do anything you don't want to." Ethan knelt down beside her, taking her small hand in his. "Nia, I know it's scary," he said gently, "but the judge needs to hear your side of the story. You're the one who's been caught in the middle of this, and your truth is powerful. It could make all the difference." Nia bit her lip, tears welling up in her eyes. "What if Grandma gets mad?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if she hates me for telling the truth?" Ethan's heart twisted at the raw fear in her voice. He squeezed her hand, his gaze steady and reassuring. "No one can hate you for telling the truth, Nia," he said firmly. "And if she really cares about you, she'll understand. But even if she doesn't, you have us. Your dad and I will be right there with you, every step of the way." Nia looked between them, her dark eyes filled with uncertainty. Then slowly she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll do it. I'll tell the judge everything." Daniel hugged her tightly, tears spilling down his cheeks. "You're so brave," he murmured. "I'm so proud of you, Nia." Ethan stood up, swallowing the lump in his throat. "We need to start preparing," he said, his voice rough. "The hearing is in 3 days. I'll gather all the evidence we have, and I'll meet with you tomorrow to go over your testimony, Nia. We're going to do everything we can to win this." 3 days later, the family court building loomed ahead, its stone facade imposing against the gray Chicago sky. Ethan parked the car and turned to look at Nia and Daniel. Nia was dressed in a simple blue dress, her hair neatly braided, but there was a nervous tension in her small frame. Daniel looked pale, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. "Remember," Ethan said, his voice low and steady, "we stick to the truth. No matter what Vivian's lawyers throw at us, we hold our ground. Nia, you just speak from your heart." Nia took a deep breath and nodded. "I'll try," she whispered. They walked into the courthouse together, Nia gripping both of their hands tightly. The hallways were filled with the hum of voices and the clacking of heels on the tile floor. Avery was waiting for them outside the courtroom, holding a folder filled with documents. She gave them a tense smile. "Everything's ready," she said, handing the folder to Ethan. "Vivian and her lawyer are already inside. They brought a few witnesses, but I think we can counter them." Ethan nodded, his face set in a grim expression. "Let's do this." The courtroom was smaller than Ethan had expected, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. Vivian Turner sat at one table, her face in a mask of calm confidence. Her lawyer, a tall, slick man named Richard Collins, stood beside her, already leafing through his notes. He gave Ethan a thin, predatory smile as they walked in. "Mr. Blake," Collins said smoothly, "I was wondering when you'd show up. Ready to defend a negligent father?" Ethan returned the smile, though his eyes were cold. "Always ready to defend the truth, Collins. Let's see how well you handle that." Daniel, looking more fragile than ever, took his seat beside Ethan. He gave Nia a small, reassuring smile as she sat down between them. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Elise Parker," the bailiff announced. Judge Parker was a stern-looking woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce right through anyone she looked at. She took her seat and glanced down at the case file before her. "We are here today to determine the custody of Nia Harper," Judge Parker said, her voice firm. "I understand that we have a petition from the child's grandmother, Mrs. Vivian Turner, contested by the child's biological father, Mr. Daniel Harper. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Collins said, standing up. "My client, Mrs. Turner, has been the primary caregiver for Nia since her mother's death. She believes that Mr. Harper is unfit to provide a stable environment for his daughter." Ethan stood as well, his expression calm but resolute. "Your Honor, we intend to prove that Mr. Harper is not only fit, but has been relentlessly searching for his daughter for the past 3 years. Mrs. Turner's actions were based on manipulation and deceit." Judge Parker's gaze flicked between the two lawyers, then settled on Nia. Her expression softened slightly. "And you, young lady," she said gently, "are you prepared to speak today?" Nia nodded, her small hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Yes, Your Honor," she whispered. Collins called Vivian to the stand first. She walked up confidently, her expression composed, as she gave her testimony. "I've taken care of Nia since she was a baby," Vivian said, her voice dripping with sincerity. "When my daughter passed away, I stepped in because Daniel wasn't capable. He abandoned his family when they needed him the most." Ethan's jaw clenched, but he kept his expression neutral. He knew this was coming. When it was his turn to cross-examine, he approached Vivian slowly, his eyes fixed on her. "Mrs. Turner," he began, his voice cool. "You say you stepped in because Daniel abandoned his family. But isn't it true that you intentionally kept Nia away from him? That you used your resources to hide her whereabouts?" Vivian's face paled slightly, but she didn't falter. "I did what I thought was best for my granddaughter." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "And did that best include telling Nia that her father didn't want her, that he was glad she was gone?" There was a murmur in the courtroom. Vivian's composure cracked. For the briefest moment, her lips pressing into a thin line. I may have said things in a moment of grief." "Thank you," Ethan said, stepping back. "No further questions." It was time for Nia's testimony. She stood up, small and trembling, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes. As she took the stand and began to speak, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. And when she finished, the truth she spoke was more powerful than any argument that had come before. The courtroom was silent as Nia stepped down from the witness stand, her small figure looking both exhausted and relieved. Ethan guided her back to her seat beside Daniel, giving her a reassuring nod. Daniel wrapped his arm around her, whispering words of comfort, though his own eyes were filled with tears. Nia had spoken her truth, clearly, bravely, and without hesitation. She had laid bare the pain of the past 3 years, exposing the lies her grandmother had told, and the deep longing she had felt for her father. Ethan glanced up at the judge, watching as she removed her glasses and rubbed her temples. Judge Elise Parker looked deeply affected, her stern expression softened by the testimony she had just heard. She took a long moment before she spoke, her voice quieter than before. "Thank you, Nia," she said gently. "You've been very brave today." Nia nodded, leaning against Daniel, who kissed the top of her head. For the first time in what felt like forever, a small, genuine smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Ethan felt a surge of hope rise within him. He turned his attention back to Vivian Turner, who was sitting at her table, looking like a ghost of her former self. The confidence she had displayed earlier had evaporated, replaced by an ashen expression. Her lawyer, Richard Collins, was whispering furiously to her, but she barely seemed to hear him. She stared straight ahead, her eyes locked on Nia, filled with a deep, indescribable sadness. Judge Parker cleared her throat, regaining the attention of the room. "I've heard the testimonies and reviewed all the evidence presented," she began. "This case has not been easy to adjudicate, given the complicated history and the deep emotions involved. But my primary concern is, and always will be, the welfare of the child." Ethan held his breath, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. He could feel the tension radiating from Daniel, who was holding Nia's hand so tightly, his knuckles were white. "It's clear to me that Mr. Harper has made extensive efforts to find his daughter," the judge continued, "efforts that demonstrate a profound love and commitment. On the other hand, Mrs. Turner's actions, while perhaps well-intentioned in her own view, have caused unnecessary pain and confusion." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Therefore, I am granting full custody of Nia Harper to her father, Daniel Harper." The words hit the room like a wave. Daniel gasped, pulling Nia into a tight embrace, his body trembling with relief. Nia clung to him, her tears wetting his shirt, but her face was lit up with a smile so bright it could have lit the entire room. Ethan exhaled the breath he didn't realize he had been holding, a triumphant smile breaking across his face. He looked over at Vivian Turner, expecting to see fury, but instead he saw something that caught him off guard. Defeat, yes, but also a deep, raw grief. Her hands were shaking as she pressed them to her mouth, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. The judge's gavel came down, signaling the end of the proceedings. "Court is adjourned," Judge Parker announced. "I wish the Harper family the best of luck as they move forward." Daniel stood up, lifting Nia into his arms, and for a moment it was as if they were the only two people in the world. He buried his face in her hair, whispering, "We did it, sweetheart. We're going home." Nia nodded, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I love you, Dad," she whispered back. Ethan watched them, feeling a swell of emotion he hadn't expected. He had been part of countless legal victories, but none of them had ever felt like this. This wasn't just a win. It was the restoration of a family, the healing of wounds that had been festering for years. Avery approached, giving Ethan a wide smile. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with pride. "I can't believe how brave Nia was up there." Ethan nodded, still watching Daniel and Nia. "She's stronger than any of us," he said quietly. "I think we've all underestimated her." Vivian Turner slowly approached, her face drawn and pale. Daniel's smile faltered when he saw her, but he didn't move away. Instead, he lowered Nia to the ground and gently squeezed her shoulder, as if to say, "It's okay." Vivian knelt down, so she was eye level with Nia. Her lip trembled, and when she spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "Nia, I'm so sorry," she said, her tears falling freely. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was doing what your mother would have wanted. But I was wrong. I hurt you, and I'm so sorry." Nia hesitated, looking up at her father for reassurance. Daniel gave her a small nod, his expression softening. Nia stepped forward and hugged her grandmother, her small arms wrapping around Vivian's neck. "I forgive you," she said simply, "but I want to be with my dad now." Vivian sobbed, hugging her back. "I understand," she whispered, "and I promise I won't fight you anymore. I just want you to be happy." They pulled apart, and Vivian stood up, giving Daniel a long, searching look. "Take care of her," she said, her voice raw. "She's all I have left of Sarah." Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with a compassion that Ethan hadn't seen before. "I will," he promised, "and you're still part of her family if you want to be." Vivian's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment she looked as if she might break down again. But instead, she gave a shaky nod. "Thank you," she whispered, before turning and walking out of the courtroom. Her shoulders slumped, as if she were carrying the weight of the world. Ethan turned back to Daniel and Naya, who were looking at him with matching smiles. Nia ran over and threw her arms around him, burying her face in his side. "Thank you, Ethan," she said softly, "for everything." Ethan knelt down and hugged her tightly. "You don't have to thank me, kiddo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did all the hard work. I just helped a little." Daniel extended his hand, and Ethan stood up, shaking it firmly. "I couldn't have done this without you," Daniel said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You brought us back together, Ethan. You gave me my daughter back." Ethan gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "I just did what I should have done a long time ago," he admitted. "But I'm glad I was able to help." They walked out of the courthouse together, the sun shining down on them, as if it were a sign of the new beginning they had all been given. Nia held both of their hands, swinging between them, her laughter filling the air like music. "So, what's next?" Ethan asked as they reached the sidewalk. Daniel looked down at Nia, who was grinning up at him. "We go home," he said simply. "We start over as a family." Nia nodded eagerly. "And can we go stargazing tonight, like you promised?" Daniel chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Of course, we can." "And Ethan?" He glanced over at his friend, a hopeful smile on his face. "You're coming with us, right?" Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Yeah," he managed to say. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." As they walked down the street together, the city bustling around them, Ethan realized that for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. He had spent so long focused on his career, on winning battles in the courtroom, that he had forgotten what it felt like to win something that truly mattered. And as he looked at the small family beside him, he knew that this was the most important victory of his life. The sky was a deep, velvety black, dotted with countless stars, as Ethan, Daniel, and Naya made their way to the outskirts of the city. The lights of Chicago faded behind them, giving way to the vast open sky that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was crisp and cool, a perfect night for stargazing. Nia was practically bouncing with excitement, her eyes wide with anticipation as she clutched her father's hand. "I can't believe we're really doing this," she whispered, her breath visible in the chilly night air. "I've always wanted to see the stars like this. Grandma never took me out of the city." Daniel glanced down at her, squeezing her hand gently. "Well, tonight is different," he said softly. "Tonight, it's just us. And we're going to see the whole universe together." Ethan trailed a few steps behind, watching them with a fond smile. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so content, so at peace. It was a far cry from the chaos of the courtroom just a few days ago. He took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh scent of pine and earth, letting it wash away the last remnants of tension. They reached a small clearing, surrounded by tall trees that framed the sky like a natural cathedral. Daniel spread out a thick blanket on the grass, and they all settled down, lying on their backs, staring up at the sky. Naya nestled between the two men, her small hands clutching theirs tightly. "Look," Ethan said, pointing upward. "There's the Big Dipper, just like we talked about." Nia's face lit up with a grin. "I see it. And that's the North Star, right?" Daniel nodded, his smile wide and genuine. "You're a natural, kiddo," he said, his voice filled with pride. You've got an eye for this. Maybe one day you'll be an astronomer." Nia giggled, the sound like music to their ears. "Maybe," she agreed, then turned her head to look at Ethan. "What do you think, Ethan? Could I be a stargazer for real?" Ethan felt his heart swell with affection. He met her gaze, nodding earnestly. "I think you can be anything you want, Nia. You're the bravest, smartest kid I've ever met." She beamed at him, then settled back down, her eyes fixed on the stars. They lay there in comfortable silence for a while, just listening to the rustle of the wind through the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. The sky seemed to shimmer, as if it were putting on a special show just for them. "I wish Mom could see this," Nia said suddenly, her voice quiet and wistful. "She used to tell me stories about the stars when I was little." Daniel's breath hitched, and he turned his head to look at her. "She loved the stars," he said softly. "When we first met, she told me that she wanted to name a star someday. Said it was like leaving a piece of herself up there forever." Ethan glanced over at him, seeing the raw emotion on his face. He knew that talking about Sarah was still painful for Daniel, but he also knew that sharing these memories with Nia was part of the healing process for both of them. "Do you think there's a star named after her now?" Nia asked, her voice full of innocent wonder. Daniel swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think she's up there, watching over us." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He turned his gaze back up to the sky, blinking away the sudden sting of tears. "I bet she's looking down right now," he said quietly. "And I bet she's really proud of you, Nia." Nia squeezed their hands tighter, her face breaking into a smile that was both sad and happy. "I hope so," she whispered. They lay there for what felt like hours, pointing out constellations, sharing stories, and just soaking in the quiet beauty of the night. It was a moment out of time, a small pocket of peace that seemed to hold all the healing they needed. Eventually, Nia's eyelids began to droop, her small body relaxing as sleep crept in. She yawned, curling up against Daniel's side. "I'm tired," she mumbled sleepily. Daniel kissed the top of her head, pulling the blanket up around her shoulders. "Close your eyes, sweetheart," he said softly. "We'll stay here with you." Nia's eyes fluttered shut, and within minutes her breathing evened out. Daniel watched her for a long moment, his face softened by love. He looked over at Ethan, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "For everything. I can't imagine how I'd have gotten through this without you." Ethan shook his head, giving him a small, lopsided smile. "You don't have to thank me, Daniel," he replied. "This was the right thing to do. It was never about winning or losing. It was about making sure Nia got her family back." Daniel nodded, his expression filled with gratitude. He leaned back, staring up at the stars. "It feels like a fresh start," he said quietly. "Like we can finally move forward." Ethan lay back down beside him, the two of them watching the stars in companionable silence. He thought about everything that had happened. The unexpected call from Daniel, the reunion with Nia, the painful memories they had all dredged up, and the fierce, desperate fight in the courtroom. It had been a whirlwind, but now, lying here under the vast sky, he felt a calmness settle over him. "Do you ever wonder what's out there?" Ethan asked after a while, his voice low. Daniel chuckled softly. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Sarah used to say that the stars were like windows into the past. She said if you looked closely enough, you could see the stories of everyone who had ever lived." Ethan smiled at the thought. "I like that," he said. "Maybe that's what we're doing tonight, telling our story to the stars." Daniel turned his head to look at him, a genuine smile on his face. "It's a good story," he said, "and I'm glad you're part of it." Ethan's smile widened, and he felt a warmth spread through his chest that he hadn't felt in years. "Me too," he said simply. They lay there in silence for a while longer, just listening to the gentle rustle of the wind and the soft chirping of crickets. It was the kind of peaceful night that Ethan had forgotten was possible, a night filled with hope and new beginnings. As the moon rose higher in the sky, casting a silvery light over the clearing, Naya stirred in her sleep, snuggling closer to Daniel. He looked down at her, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" he asked quietly, almost as if he were talking to himself. Ethan turned to him, his expression filled with quiet conviction. "Yeah, we are," he said firmly. "We've got each other now. That's all we need." Daniel nodded, his eyes shining with a mix of relief and joy. He took a deep breath, looking back up at the stars. "Let's make a promise," he said suddenly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "A promise?" "Yeah," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "That no matter what happens, we stick together. For Naya. For all of us." Ethan felt a surge of emotion swell in his chest. He reached out and clasped Daniel's hand, squeezing it tightly. "I promise," he said, his voice steady. They lay there, hands clasped, staring up at the stars. And in that moment, they weren't just friends. They were family. The sky stretched out above them, vast and filled with infinite possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. Because sometimes, under the starlit sky, you find not just a new beginning, but a place to call home. What would you have done if you were in Ethan's shoes? Could you have fought against the lies and manipulation like Daniel did?